Thanks everybody for coming. Today we're receiving Priyanka Haran. Priyanka is a final year PhD candidate in interdisciplinary ecology at the School of Natural Resources and Environment. She came to UF in fall 2021 with a master's degree in ecology and environmental sciences from Pondicherry University in India. And before starting her doctoral research, she worked with the Nature Conservation Foundation in India to assess restoration outcomes in rainforest birds. She has also policy experience, having worked as an editorial assistant on India's national report for COP24. A passionate science writer, her work has been published in Manga Bay, India, Yale 360, and several Indian news outlets. She now dabbles in social science and economics. So thanks, Priyanka, for coming, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you all for coming to this talk. I am about to defend my PhD in like a week, so this is a version of the talk that I gave yesterday at my exit seminar. So yeah, I'm affiliated to a bunch of different departments here at UF, and TCD has been a really important part of that. I also want to thank some external funders who provided the money for me to be able to go and do the research in India. So you're going to hear a lot about Indian wildlife today. I was looking over my CV just before this talk, and it turns out TCD has given me a lot of support over the years. That's conference grant times X. I think for as long as I've been here, I think. So I'm super thankful, and I'm super happy to be talking to you today. I've also taken the best courses as part of my TCD certificate. So if anybody wants to chat about what courses they're thinking about taking a TCD, I'm super happy to talk about that as well. So when we think of a tropical rainforest and the biodiversity within, we're often thinking of images like this. In my field site, it's easy for me to imagine that there's tigers and elephants and all the invasive bird species inside of this forest. But often this is what my field site looks like. There's very commonplace interactions between people and wildlife, and this is not an uncommon image from my field site. So I've had to stop field work because there have been elephants, or like there have been other big megafauna in the way of me studying the birds. So I've been fascinated for a long time about how this biodiversity wildlife persists outside PAs in these mixed-use landscapes. And I was also interested in finding out what behaviors, how do they change their behaviors in order to be able to persist in these landscapes. And finally, how we can best monitor them, given that we have limited resources for conservation monitoring. So I study this model system, really. They're called mixed species flocks. And it's basically a bunch of interacting species that if you've ever gone birding and there's just like quiet for a while, and then there's just a bunch of birds, that's a mixed species flock. It's a really cool interaction system in a lot of tropical forests. This is how a lot of birds forage. It's really important for a couple of different reasons. One, it allows birds to forage more efficiently. So they learn from other species about where the food is available, how best to go and get that food. They will copy other birds trying to get food a certain way. They'll learn from that. There's a lot of information provision. They will eavesdrop on other species to learn the best information about the habitat that they're foraging in. And then there's the other thing is that's a little hawk over there, if you can do that. Yeah, so a lot of these birds are small insectivorous birds. So there's always predators looking to make a meal out of them. And there's safety in numbers, right? So this is really good for a lot of the smaller birds. But also there are birds that will provide alarm calls when there's a predator around. So these birds know when they should be on the lookout. So, like I said, there's a lot of information exchange here. The main draw for why these birds participate in these flocks is their interactions with these other species, which is even more for them a draw than the food itself. And species often play really distinct roles within these flocks. They'll either be a leader, a follower, or they'll be the species that gives out the alarm calls. So it's also really intuitive to think of flocks as networks. So you can think of in network speak, we call the species nodes, and we call the edges interactions. And then depending on how much two species interact, we quantify the strength of interactions in that way. But at my field site, I wanted to give you an introduction to some of the species that participate. So there are some species that we call gregarious species. These are family groups. So it's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 members of the same species. So we have species like the fulvetas, the minivets, the white-eyes, which are constantly talking. They're constantly looking out for family members. So that's a lot of information that other species will eavesdrop on. And then we have sentinel species like the strongo with the cool tail, which provides a lot of alarm calls that a lot of other species will, again, eavesdrop on and learn from. And finally, the bulk of tropical species that are insectivorous will follow these leaders. This is the only way that they can forage at all in tropical forests, so it's really, really important for them to be part of the flock. And then sometimes, depending on the context, some leader species can also be part of the following community. So I first got interested in this when I started my master's and I worked inside of the area. And I was trying to understand how flocks, pick which habitats that they want to forage from. So I started looking at that. I did a bunch of field work. And then once I finished my master's, I worked with a nonprofit that was trying to assess how a 20-year rainforest restoration project was impacting birds. So specifically, we were looking at whether these restored sites were drawing in really specialized rainforest birds. So I got a taste of what it was like to work outside PAs in these very human-modified landscapes. But then I noticed that there were flocks there as well. So it wasn't that the flocks were only inside PAs. So once I found that out, the next question for me was, how are they managing to keep their interactions? How are they managing to forage in these very, very modified landscapes, given that they are specialized and adapted to be foraging inside PAs? So that was the question that I wanted to explore for my PhD. And so I came to UF and I was insistent that I would go back to my field site in India. So this is in the southern half of India. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It's the Western Ghats mountain range. So I worked in 2 mountain ranges. One is the Anamalai Hills and one is the Nilgiri Hills. It's separated by this valley called the Palghat Cap. So the forests here are mostly rainforests. They're tropical montane forests, pretty high up, and a lot of bird diversity. So again, when I say biodiversity hotspot, that's what we're thinking of, right? Like this beautiful, lush rainforest, unbroken rivers flowing through. But that's what a lot of the areas outside the areas looks like. In my site, that's me trying to follow a bird, and that's a tea plantation. And then on the side, you can see a little forest fragment there, but a lot of it is tea plantations, coffee plantations, other exotic like timber plantations that people have planted there. But I noticed that my flocks and generally birds in general, right? Like they would come, they would hang out on one tree. It's not a great tree because it's, they don't have insect resources there the way that they will if it was a native tree species. But they'll still do what they can. They'll hop from tree to tree. They'll use the landscape as best as they can. So I wanted to know how they were able to do this, right? So are they following different species than they would if they were in forest? Because there are specialized leaders in forest, but those leaders don't exactly exist outside forest because they're not disturbance tolerant. They need really good, beautiful forests to be living in. So I was wondering, who do we consider as the important like leader species now, right? And then how do we measure that? And if we measure that different ways, is the identity of that leader species going to be different in each of those contexts? So typically, this people have measured leadership in 3 or 4 different ways. One is by observation. So the very first papers that I read about species flocks, people had done all of this amazing work in South America, where they would just walk trails. They would go to the edge of a trail or a road or a river, and they would just wait for the flock to cross over, and they would say, okay, that bird went first, and then this species followed, and then this species followed. And when you do this enough number of times, you can figure out who's leading the flock in most contexts. So that's how people did it, and it also gives you an idea of what species is pointing the flock in the direction that they're foraging in. So what species is responsible for choosing the habitat that the flock forages in. And then experiments. So experiments have typically been playback experiments. So people will they'll have a recorder, and they'll do like playbacks, or they'll basically play the calls of potential leader species, and then they'll wait and watch to see how many species respond to that. Either the species will approach the recorder and they'll like want to see what's going on, or they will respond with a call. Right? So those are typically the ways that people have seen what species is providing the most information, right? How do you test that? So the other thing is that people have done network analyses. So there's people will measure what's central to the flock network, like what species is really important in the flock network as a whole. And then the last thing is that people will use passive acoustic monitoring, which is just you put out audio recorders in forests, you leave them on for weeks, months, maybe even years, and then you try and figure out how do these flocks form. Right, so who is initiating these flock calls? How do they form in the morning, and how do they disband, and how do they keep together? So that's the kind of information that if you were there, maybe you would see it, maybe you wouldn't, but a recorder is always going to pick up those calls. So that's one cool way that people would measure this. And like I said, this might not all be the same species. This could each of these roles could be provided by different species. And we have some information about who is providing these roles inside protected areas, but we know very little about who's doing all these different jobs outside PAs. And I think it's really important that we know who's doing that outside PAs, because a lot of birds exist outside PAs, and we need to be able to know what to conserve. We have a few different contenders for who could be flock leaders. So that's the orange minivet, the Indian white-eye, the brown-cheeked pavetta, and the black-tailed bronco. So here the first 3 species they're like this minivet. They're all gregarious species, so they're part of that family group that I was talking about earlier. So there's never just one of them in a flock. It'll always be at least 2 or more. So the minivet is a really flashy canopy bird. The female is also just as flashy, just bright yellow instead of bright orange. And the Indian white-eye is a super common flock participant. So over 80% of my flocks always had a minivet in it. So it's a super disturbance tolerant species, and you would think that it would do well outside a protected area. And then the fulvetta is the forest specialist. It's who people think of as the leader typically, except they've all done those studies inside PA. And then finally, you have species like the strongbow, which are really cool, like aerial, like flycatchers. So the way that they forage is that they'll see an insect in the air, and they'll sort of like dive sally up to get the insect. So that naturally makes them really good at also looking out for predators, so they're good alarm call providers. So we found a total of 136 flocks over our fieldwork time, and about 45 different species participated. So this is what it would look like for me to do fieldwork, right? Like I would just walk at the edge of the trail, and I would try and observe basically who crosses the trail first and who follows. So I would watch one species go by, I would note that down, and then I would check to see if anybody followed them. Sometimes the species would go and nobody would follow them. And sometimes they didn't cross at all. So I would just kind of walk along with them and wait for them to cross, but they would never do that. So what we found was that when the fulvetta, so this is the forest specialist species, right? So when the fulvetta was present, it was always a really good leader. It led like 100% of the time. So the green, so the fulvetta is entirely green. That means it was always leading. And the minivet was also a pretty good leader. And then finally, the white-eye was not a great leader. Despite being in over like 80% of my flocks, it was not at all a good leader. And then we looked a little more closely at this, and we found out that no matter what other leader species is present, the fulvetta is always a leader. And then if the fulvetta is not present, the minivet is a leader, and only if nobody else is present will the white-eye lead. So we felt pretty comfortable thinking, okay, so the minivet and fulvetta are really important for allowing flocks to forage in the area that they're in. The white-eye, not so important. And then we did the experiments, right? Like the playback experiments. I worked with some amazing interns. I was doing field work in 2 mountain ranges simultaneously, so it was really useful for them to be helping me out with this, and they were just fantastic. So here we would do the playback. We would have Bluetooth speakers that we would put on like a tree, and then we would just do the playback calls, and then we would just like step back and we would watch to see who responded, who maybe approached the speaker, or who just responded. So we were looking to see the species that could attract the most other species. So we did something like 400 playback experiments, and we used 6 different bird calls. So we wanted to check if any one of those 6 would have the most response. And then we used one control species, which was a dove, and doves don't participate in mixed species flocks. So we just wanted that as a control. So here, these are the results of the playback experiment. The green bar shows you how many birds were present before we did the playback. So we would do like a little point count just before we got to the site. Just as soon as we got to the site. And then so here, like on average, there were about 10 species every time that we did a minivet playback. But over time, we noticed that the minivet brought in more species, right? So that's about like 12, 13. So it attracted more species that were already present when we did the playback. And then here's the rest of them, right? Like so the rackettail drongo was also pretty good at bringing species in, and so was the fulvetta. But then, so that's basically if there's an asterisk, they were good at it, and if not so much. So the white-eye sort of again didn't do so well, despite being in a lot of flocks, didn't do so great. And then all of these other species that we thought could potentially maybe be playing this role, not so much. So we thought that those 3 species did very well. And then the network analysis compared to the rest of my field work is not as exciting because it's just me trying to figure out just like network analysis to try and figure out what's really central to the flock network. So we used this metric called the weighted degree to basically compare flocks. So on the x-axis there is how many flocks that the species occurred in. So it's just a percentage of flocks that the species occurred in. And the y-axis is the weighted degree metric itself that we found that species had. So here you can see the white-eye, close to 80% of the flocks. It was present in a lot of flocks. And then the minivet was maybe 50-ish% of flocks. And then they're pretty high up on the weighted degree axis also, so they were pretty important. So, but then if you see that dot over there, that's this really cool species.
We can move it over.
Yeah. So it's this really cool species. It's a really cool species. I say it's cool because this species has a very unique way of foraging. It's a nuthatch. So a lot of the birds are like hopping from tree to tree and then moving through the forest or whatever landscape, right? And then the nuthatch goes like this. It looks like a spider on the tree bark. So it has a very unique way of foraging, and it's always a fun bird to watch. So I was very pleasantly surprised that this was not a bird that we were expecting would be important, but it did show up. So for me, it just kind of reinforced the idea that like we should be really testing this out in multiple ways. Oh, yeah. So the final way that we also wanted to look at what species was important was through this recorder. So that's a recorder tied to a tree there. So we put out about 9 different recorders. We put them in tea plantations, in coffee plantations, and in forest fragments. And we let them go for about a month. So they would record every day from 6 a.m. to about 12 p.m. The main question that we wanted to answer here was who's calling just before flocks form? So flocks only really start to form at my field site around 8 a.m. So the birds have this dawn chorus where they're all like singing at like 5:30, 6 o'clock. And then they're sort of, I think they're figuring out how to assemble themselves. Around that 7 to 8 a.m. time is when they're trying to figure out, okay, I guess we start the day, I guess we start to eat now. So they're putting themselves into those assemblages, into those groups. So I think that's a really crucial time for us to be monitoring these landscapes. And it's really hard to do this without putting out like recorders there, because you have to go find the birds and then you have to try and figure out how they're, it's really hard to see a flock. So you mostly go by sound anyway, because they're really small birds and it's really big canopy. So this is a really cool way for us to be able to do that without being there in person. So here we found that when the fulvetta is present, that's a site that it's super abundant in. It's constantly calling between that window, between the 7 to 8 a.m. It's really good at calling. But it's not very abundant here because I didn't work inside forest and it's not a disturbance tolerant species, right? So it turns out when it's not so common, all of those blank spaces that you see up there. So it looks like the minivet and the white-eye are both pitching in, and they're trying to fill that quiet time with their call. So maybe they're the ones initiating flocks in those areas. So yeah, I put the white-eye in here. It showed up as important finally. So the main, from this part of my PhD, what my main takeaways were, species importance, we need to be really careful in how we define it. One of the reasons why we started doing this work was because we looked at all these different papers and nobody agreed on what an important species was or how you would measure it. So I think we really need to be clear in how we define that term species importance. And then using more than one method, it'll only help us give a more complete understanding of species roles, because what's important in one method is not going to show up in another method. So if you just base your analysis on just one of those methods, you're going to lose some species that are important because they're not going to show up in your analysis. And then finally, we should be looking at species importance outside PAs because I think their roles are changing, right? Like I think if this work was done inside a protected area, the fulvetta would have been super important in every case. But what happens when the fulvetta isn't there, right? And that's the reality in a lot of this PA, outside PAs. So while I was doing that work, I was putting on these recorders and reading all these papers about acoustics. And so in every paper, I don't know if you ever read a paper about acoustics, I guarantee that you will find the words low cost, low effort in it. And that's because, you think about like putting a team of researchers or a team of like assistants out there, and if you're training them on how to look at birds and you're teaching them about bird calls, and then they go out there for days on end, right? And it's so simple because instead of doing all of that, you just put out a recorder and then just analyze the data, right? So it's really thought of as low cost and low effort. I've done it myself. I've written that in papers myself. But I started really thinking about, is it really low cost everywhere, right? because the context of what low cost means in the global south and global north can be very, very different. And then I was also wondering, okay, say it's not low cost, say it's not cost effective. If you did a longer project, would that make it a bit more cost effective because you can sort of share the cost of this equipment and this analysis over all those years? So maybe it'll be cost effective then. So for this, I worked within this cost effectiveness framework. So I kind of had to learn how to do economic analysis. So I'm super happy to hear comments on this part. So yeah, I basically did 31 key informant surveys. So I went to to researchers from either India or the US who did or didn't use acoustics. So these were field biologists who study birds. And I found people who already use acoustics and then people who could potentially use acoustics for their work, but they don't currently. And then we projected so we gave them a budget sheet. We said, here's the project. It's a 1 year long project. It's your research question. 250 square kilometers, 1 year long. You have to buy all the equipment from scratch. And we had them fill out these budget sheets. And then we projected those costs onto 5 and 10 year timelines to try and see whether it would look any different if you did that project for a longer time. And also we thought about how potentially over these 5 and 10 year timelines, recorder costs could get used, data storage costs could get used, and we tried to model that into our within this framework to try and see if those things would make using acoustics more cost effective. So our main finding here was that acoustics is not cost effective for a 1 year project in India. So on the left there is India, and on the right is the US. The blue is if you did your project using acoustics, and the brown is if you didn't use acoustics. So we found that, yeah, of course, the project is going to cost more to do in the US. Just that's not surprising, right? But what was surprising was that the gap between the brown and the blue in each case, right? So it costs about $8,000 more to be doing a project using acoustics in India compared to not using acoustics. But in the US, that difference is really small. It's only about $1,500. So, if you had to do a project on birds in the US, you could honestly pick either acoustics or not. But in India, that's a very big decision because it's $8,000 more expensive to be using acoustics. And we see this difference mainly because of labor and recorder costs. So on the left, again, is India, and on the right is the US. So in India, to hire somebody with a master's to help you with the project, it costs about $350, $400, and that is almost equivalent to how much a mid-range recorder costs, which is also about $350. But in the US, it costs about $2,500 to hire somebody with the same qualifications, but that is more than 3 times the cost of the most expensive recorder. So the most expensive recorder is about $800, and it costs $2,500 to hire somebody for just 1 month. So I feel like that's what is really driving people's decisions, because it really is the disparity is pretty stark between the two countries. So over these timelines, right, over the longer timelines of 5 and 10 years, how does this work compared to this 1 year timeline that we've gone to performance asking about? So the brown lollipops there are under, if recorder costs didn't go down at all, and the dotted line that you see there, that is the baseline for what the project would cost if you didn't use acoustics. So using just standard point counts, binoculars, that kind of thing. So like I said, it costs about $8,000 more if you use acoustics in India, right? But then the light blue is what happens if recorder costs go down by 25%. And then the dark blue is what happens if recorder costs go down even more by 87%. And these are actual projected costs that we looked at from the published literature. So it turns out that even if with a drastic reduction of 87% of the recorder cost currently, it's still not cost effective to be using acoustics to monitor birds in India for 1 year, right? So over 5 and 10 years, it's about the same thing, right? So even in the 10-year scenario, in the most optimistic scenario where your recorder costs go way down, it is still not cost effective to be using acoustics in India. But in the US, here's what the 1 year looks like, right? So it's, like I said, about a $1,500 difference between using acoustics and not using acoustics. And that goes down to maybe $700, $800 if recorder costs go down. And over 5 and 10 years, it looks wildly different than India. So around the 5-year mark, basically, if your recorder costs go down by a lot, it's already more cost effective to be using acoustics in place of standard ecological methods. But in the 10-year scenario, no matter what happens, so even if costs didn't go down at all, you just use the today's costs, right? Even under that scenario, it's still more effective to be using acoustics instead of using kind of cool thing that I also found in how people responded to the survey was that we asked them, so I didn't give them an upper limit to their budgets. So I didn't say you have this much to spend, how will you spend it? I said, here's what you need to do, give me a budget, right? But weirdly in India, people will, so there's three, I gave them 3 recorder options. I said, here's an $80 one, a $350 one, and an $800 one. And you can see that in India, people overwhelmingly picked the cheapest one. And in the US, they picked the mid-range recorders. And then I guess there are some like really well-funded people who picked like the most expensive recorders in both cases. But to me, this was really interesting because I didn't tell them to limit themselves in any way, but people in India did, because I think it just sounds wild to be saying, I'll purchase, I don't know, like 100 $350 recorders because there is so much money in India compared to the US. I guess people felt more comfortable because they thought, oh, that's not even as much as, that's nowhere close to how much it would take for me to hire somebody, right? And I think people are subconsciously thinking in those ways. So I asked them, the people who do use acoustics, I asked, why do you use acoustics? So a lot of them said it's less labor intensive to use acoustics. So I don't know if they're thinking about all of the different costs that go into, especially in India, right? Like a lot of people in India said that they use acoustics because it's less labor intensive. And I don't know if they're thinking about all the analysis costs and the data storage costs. I mean, not the cost, the effort that goes into maintaining those data sets and analyzing the data and doing all of that stuff. I don't know if they're thinking about that. And in 10% of respondents in India actually thought that it was cheaper than using field methods, which is just not the case. No matter what you do, it's not cheaper. So unless they are, these really odd, scenarios where it's actually more profitable in India to be using acoustics, which I'm not seeing any of that, but they seem to think that it's cheaper to be using acoustics. And then a lot of people also said, I can reanalyze the data. So a lot of acoustics papers have also been pushing this, right? So they say, if you collect data, you can go back in a year or 2 years, you can go back and say you thought of this other research question and you're like, I have the data, I can go back and reanalyze to see, okay, what is this species doing, which I didn't look at last time because you already have that data. But the truth is, we all have data sets that we don't use, right? Like we all have this data set that we're like, that would be a really cool paper, and we've never gone back to it, right? So unless you actually do it, you haven't done it. So until you do that, it's still not cost effective to be using that data set. So I asked the people who didn't use acoustics, why don't you use acoustics? And they said that the leading reason for why they don't use acoustics is because they just said, I can answer my question without it. They're able to do it without it, so they didn't see a need to be adopting this new technology. And then some other issues where, that is a lot of work to learn how to manage. It's a lot of data, like 24/7 per month is a lot of data. And you need to be able to know how to manage it, how to curate it, how to store it, a lot of that stuff. Some folks thought it was too expensive. Again, I think startlingly few folks in India thought it was expensive. I would have thought that, I don't know, 90% of them would have thought that's going to be expensive, but no. And then in India, right, like the other big thing is acquiring recorders, because currently we don't make in-country recorders in India. So a lot of them get imported from here or Europe or wherever, right? So I think one way in which this could be made more accessible to people in India is if we started making in-country recorders, on a mass scale, but that hasn't happened so far. So they're still relying on either shipping them internationally and paying those costs, or finding somebody to like sort of ferry it for them. And all of that is networking and like connections and stuff, right? So if you have it, you have it. If not, you pay for it. Right? So I just want to conclude by saying we really need to be thinking about all the costs of logistics before we adopt it. And that means thinking in advance about how you'll use the data, how you'll analyze it, how you'll store it. And then we should be thinking about the project timeline. So there's a lot of data to basically show that if it's just a short 1-year project, do you really need to use it, right? First, it's a long-term program in which you're like, okay, this will pay off. I think people should feel more confident in saying that if their project is longer, and not so much if it's a very short project, at least right now. And then finally, whether low cost, low effort is truly cost effective in the global south. It's true that it is low cost, low effort in some places, but that's not everywhere. So just to wrap this up, I think the new benchmark is mixed use landscapes. I think we should be studying species interactions outside PAs. For the longest time, people in the field of tropical biology have been saying that we should be making these comparisons to species interactions and richness and abundance inside PAs, but the reality is that there's a lot more of this kind of habitat than there is protected areas, and that's not changing anytime soon. Ecological roles can change, so we need to be very careful in how we define and measure species importance. And finally, context matters. Low cost is not low cost everywhere, and the global south should be the baseline for what's affordable, because a lot of our wildlife is there, and a lot of people, even based in the US, will go down to the tropics to study this wildlife. So what's affordable there should be thought of as the baseline for what's affordable. And I just realized I have my slide from yesterday for the acknowledgements, so I'm just going to zip right through. Thank you for a lot of people. Thank you for like this big community that has been around, but I